greetings, my relatives. Welcome to another program, Eagle and Condor. This is Tony Gonzalez, your host, and today, Sunday, May 4, 2025. I just want to wish the Mother's Day coming up. Big powwow at Stanford, the 54th annual. So all you listeners and viewers, be sure you get your moms, your aunties, your grandmothers, and honor them at the Stanford powwow. That's the 54th powwow, May 9, 10, and 11. And also my relatives, Cinco de Mayo, May the 5th, right around the corner here on Monday. Be thankful that Mexico was victorious in this renowned battle that was fought in Puebla. If the Mexican people and the Mexicas had not defeated the French, we would all be speaking French here today, because it was Abraham Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln, that wrote to Benito Juarez, told him, hold the line, don't let the French come up here. And so a salute to Cinco de Mayo peoples. And my relatives today, Sunday, and the Sundays coming forward, I want to introduce you to a series of videos of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And one was just held, the 24th session, April 21 through May the 2nd. And I have videos for every one of those days. I want you to see, I want to bring the General Assembly room, the United Nations, into your living room so you can see the achievements, the contributions, the resilience, and the inroads that indigenous peoples of the world are making within the United Nations system. So today, we're going to start out with the opening, April 21, at the United Nations in the General Assembly room. And you will see a land acknowledgement, as we now provide all across the country, acknowledging indigenous peoples. And it'll be conducted by a spiritual leader of the Haudenosaunee Nation, Chief, that is Chief Sid Hill. And after him, you will see the chairperson for the gathering will introduce the UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez, who gave an inspiring talk of Indian peoples engaging governments in the United Nations. I'd like for you to pay particular attention to that. But also, there will be the president of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations from Canada. His name is Bob Gray. There'll be another speaker, the Vice President of the General Assembly himself, Philemon Yan, on behalf of the General Assembly, mind you. And also we will hear the Minister of Environment of Colombia give a talk of the need to move away from fossil fuels and addressing the debt indebted countries of the world as well. So tune into that, my relatives. And also the Undersecretary of the Economic and Social Affairs, and that is Mr. Lee Gan Wang. And it may seem like a pompous affair for the opening day, but it's very important that these people address the General Assembly of indigenous peoples. So my relatives, let's go into that now. I hope you enjoy it. Tell your friends to watch Eagle and Condor Sundays at 4, and I will be presenting you a series of videos of the 24th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and it all circles around the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. And those rights of the world's Indigenous peoples was adopted by the General Assembly in September 13, 2007. All right, my relatives, let's go into that video.
Distinguished members of the forum, distinguished delegates, observers and friends, I have the honor to declare open the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It is a great pleasure to warmly welcome you all today. In accordance with the customs of the Indigenous peoples and in recognition of the peoples of these lands, we will now have a traditional ceremonial welcome by the traditional chief of the Onondaga Nation, Taduta Ho Sit-Hild. Peace.
Now, all of you to listen. Become my duty to bring forth the words. I can't hear him. It become my duty to put through this first matter. Now, on this day as it is, the sunlight as it is, that peaceful our minds should be, then the many of people of us that are gathered at this place, we put our minds together as one. First, we greet one another. We give thanks to our Mother, the Earth. And we'll let it be that way in our minds. And so now the Creator has put down, as we walk about here on earth, we give a great thanks and everything to help us as we walk about here on earth. We put our minds together as one and give a great gratitude for everything that was put here. So we let it be that way in our minds. And so now we give thanks to the things set down to us, peacefulness and contentment as we walk about here on earth. This great matter that was planted here for us, and also the gentle winds that come across the lands, that we give thanks. And so then we'll let it be that way in our minds, that we give great gratitude to all that was put here for us on earth, our Mother. So now the thunder beings that we direct our thoughts to help with all that was planted here for us to be at peace and contentment. Thunder beings, they bring the waters, their thundering voices bring the waters and awaken all the plant life to be watered and grow for us to be at peace and contentment here on earth. And so now we put our minds together as one, and we give a great gratitude to all that are still following the original instructions for us to be at peace and contentment here on earth. And so now we direct our thoughts to the four beings who watch over us in our minds, and all that was put here and all that was completed for us to be able to see and take care of us as we walk about here on earth. And so the four beings that help guide our minds in peace and contentment and keep our minds straight to the good path of this earth. And so also the messenger that brought us the message to keep our minds at peace. We put our minds together as one and give a great gratitude to all that was put here and the four beings that watch over our minds as we walk about here on earth. So we'll let it be that way in our minds. And so now we direct our thoughts to the Creator and all the beings that He had put here so that we could enjoy ourselves here on earth in peace and contentment also. And all of us there to give thanks to our Creator that we still see what He has planted for us to take care of our minds at peace, and also everything that was completed for us to be at peace when we walk about here on earth. And so now we put our minds together in great gratitude to the Creator for putting all this stuff here for us to be at peace and contentment as we walk about here on Mother Earth. Donato.
I thank the traditional chief of the Onondaga Nation, Tatudaho the Silt Hill, for the ceremonial welcome to the participants at the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Distinguished members of the Forum, distinguished delegates, we shall now proceed to the first item on the agenda this morning, the election of the chairperson for the session. I first give the floor to distinguished foreign member, Mr. Hinduda Omaru de Ibrahim from Chad, the chairperson of the forum at its 23rd session in 2024. You have the floor, Madam.
Good morning, on Bali Jam, on Pini Jam. Thank you, Chair, distinguished members of the forum, Excellencies, friends, sisters, and brothers. We, members of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, have convened to guide our work and represent the mandate that has been trusted to us. In accordance with these principles, the Permanent Forum needs to ensure that equitable representation and shared responsibility rotated among the members and region. And this is why rotation of the chair is so important. Therefore, I nominate my fellow Sister Aluki, co-chair of Canada, for the position of the chair of the 24th sessions of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues. I thank you, Chair.
I thank Ms. Hinduda Omaru de Ibrahim for nominating the candidate for the chair. I now give the floor to distinguished foreign member, Mr. Dario Maggio de Montalva, chairperson of the forum at its 21st and 22nd session in 2022 and 2023. You have the floor, please.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente, por otorgarme.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Distinguished members of the Permanent Forum, distinguished delegations, it's a great honor for me to express my absolute full respect to the candidature of Aluki Kutuel. With the great belief that her experience, her leadership, and her deep commitment to the rights of Indigenous peoples give her the right skills to become our chair for this session. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Dario Maggio de Montalva for his statement. May I take it that it is the wish of the members of the Permanent Forum to elect Mr. Aluki de Curta from Canada as the chair of the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues by acclamation? It is so decided. I wish to extend my warmest congratulations to Ms. Aluki de Curta for her election, and that I'm confident that she will guide the session of the forum to a successful conclusion. I now invite Ms. Aluki Curta to come up to the podium to preside over the remainder of the proceedings of this morning.
Koyanami Mareru, Your Excellency Antonio Gutierrez, Secretary General, Your Excellency Bob Ray, President of Economic and Social Council, Your Excellency Lena Yanina Estrada, Minister for Environment from Colombia, Mr. Lee Junhua, Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, distinguished members of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, distinguished elders, delegates, Indigenous sisters and brothers. I open this 24th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues with deep respect for our peoples and a firm commitment to our shared responsibilities. We begin by recognizing the Onondaga Nation, the original stewards of this land, and by expressing our gratitude to Tadodaho Sidhill, the traditional chief of the Onondaga Nation, for once again welcoming us to their territory. Koyanami Mareruk Nunasinno Tungasuptitigabin. Let us also thank the Indigenous youth who accompanied us with grace into the General Assembly Hall. Their violin performance honoring our elders, our women, and the sacred memory of those who came before us. Their music carried the spirit of our ancestors into this house of nations, a place of dialogue, multilateralism, and shared responsibility. Yupai Chani. I am deeply grateful to my fellow members of the Forum for their confidence in electing me to serve as the chair of this session. Together, we will build on the path already pioneered by our predecessors. I am grateful to my sister and fellow member, Ms. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, President of the 23rd session, for her leadership, commitment, wisdom, and vision. Huyanami. I am fortunate to count 2 former chairs among my colleagues, so I could not pass up the opportunity to acknowledge the tremendous and inspiring leadership of my brother Dario Mejia Montalvo, also a former chair of the Forum. He has earned my great admiration and respect. Gracias. I take this moment to acknowledge the continued commitment and dedication of former chairs and members of the Forum who, over time, have provided me with encouragement and advice. Finally, I would not be at this forum without the joint nomination of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Sami Council. Koyanak, Gito. I grew up on a small island in a flying community located in the eastern part of the Arctic in Canada, with a population made up of less than probably all the people in this room. It was the center of my universe, and I imagined that I would grow up and live there and have children there. I would not have described it as an isolated or remote community, nor would I have described the environment as harsh, adjectives that are so often used to describe the Arctic, our home. Televisions were not allowed in my community until I was about 10 years old, and even then, not everyone had one. Up until that time, through community plebiscites, community members had voted against allowing televisions into our community because there was a fear that they would negatively impact on our language and our culture. Protecting our language and our culture has continued to be paramount. Inuit want to be able to continue speaking Inuktun. Inuit want to continue to live life as Inuit. We want to thrive as Inuit. The advocacy work The work undertaken to protect Indigenous peoples' rights is personal. When I use the International Decade of Indigenous Languages as a vehicle to underline the importance of Indigenous peoples receiving essential public services in Indigenous languages, I am thinking about unilingual family members and community members who are unable to receive essential public services in Inuktitut, the only language that they know how to speak. I am thinking about family members and community members who are not afforded the human right of dignity in their own homeland. When I look around this room, I know that each of you has your story. Stories of where you are from, stories of your motivation, stories of your hardships, stories of your success, of your successes, stories of acts of resistance. Our stories may be a bit different, but what brings us all together is a deep desire to continue to assert who we are as Indigenous peoples. We want to unapologetically thrive as Indigenous peoples. That is why it is so crucially and personally important to Indigenous peoples that the universal framework to protect the rights, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples worldwide be fully implemented. Thank you all so much for your continued efforts. I thank each of you for traveling here from long distance to be here today. I welcome each of you, especially my Indigenous sisters and brothers from around the world. Your presence here is a powerful reminder that despite centuries of colonization, marginalization, and violence, Indigenous peoples continue to resist creatively, always joyfully in the face of adversity, and united with our Mother Earth, defending our rights to ensure a better future for future generations. Also, I want to take a moment to remember and honor all those who are not here with us today, those who, for whatever reason, were not able to travel here to join us, and those who came before us, our ancestors, our elders, and the countless Indigenous leaders and activists who sacrificed their lives to defend the rights we continue to assert. Excellencies, colleagues, friends, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has long served as a vital platform, a space where Indigenous peoples bring our priorities, wisdom, and concerns to the center of international discourse. This forum wasn't simply given. It exists today because Indigenous peoples fought long and hard for recognition, representation, and a voice at the global level. And while it has enabled important dialogue, it must also continue to drive transformative action. This year's theme, implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within member states and the United Nations system, including identifying good practices and addressing challenges, compels us to ask, where do we stand? Yes, we have seen progress. Since the forum's establishment, significant gains have been made. The adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007 was a historic milestone, grounded in decades of advocacy. The 2014 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples reaffirmed global commitments and prompted mechanisms like the UN system-wide action plan and the ongoing consultations to enhance Indigenous peoples' participation at the UN. But let us be honest, progress remains uneven and in many cases merely symbolic. Too many Indigenous peoples are still excluded from decisions that directly affect what is most sacred to us, our lands, territories, cultures, and the future of our communities. These are not abstract concepts. They are the very foundation of our identity, survival, and self-determination. Some states, after affirming their recognition of Indigenous peoples through their affirmative vote in the adoption of the Declaration, have subsequently refused to recognize them within their own borders. Instead, they have chosen to call them by other names. I invite you to discuss this persistent and regrettable situation. Violations of Indigenous peoples' rights and our fundamental human rights persist. Our leaders continue to be criminalized and persecuted, and in some cases, they have lost their lives for defending their peoples and territories. Sacred sites are taken without our free, prior, and informed consent and are desecrated. Indigenous women and girls continue to face disproportionate levels of violence and marginalization. In many communities, as Indigenous men are disappeared or targeted, women are left to carry the burden, becoming the heads of their families and defenders of their peoples. The implementation of UNDRIP must go beyond symbolic recognition. It must be fully integrated into national laws, policies, and institutions. It must inform development, environmental protection, and peace-building efforts. It must be reflected in budgets and financial investment and the work of every state at all levels, as well as every UN body. This session places a powerful spotlight on some of the most urgent and interconnected issues facing Indigenous peoples today. This year, we inaugurate a new intergenerational and interregional dialogue focusing on the rights of Indigenous women. Across the globe, Indigenous women stand at the crossroads of gender-based discrimination, colonial violence, and systemic marginalization. Yet, they are also protectors of knowledge, guardians of biodiversity, cultural leaders, and agents of change. Their role must not only be recognized, it must be resourced and respected. The adoption of CEDAW General Recommendation Number 39 is an important step, but it must be implemented with the leadership of Indigenous women themselves at every stage. The global push for the so-called green transition has intensified demand for critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and others, many of which lie beneath sacred Indigenous lands and territories. We cannot ignore this threat poses to our rights, lands, and way of life. Extractive activities, when carried out in disregard of the right to self-determination and the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, become another form of colonialism. We are not anti-development, but development must be on our terms and must be just. It must respect our forms of self-governance, uphold environmental safeguards, and include equitable benefit-sharing mechanisms. This session will explore how to uphold the principles of UNDRIP in the context of the green economy, ensuring that solutions to climate change do not become new forms of exploitation of Indigenous peoples. Implementation also requires investment. Too often, financial resources designated for Indigenous peoples are diverted, delayed, or managed by intermediaries. This undermines our autonomy, diminishes our impact, and perpetuates dependency. Direct, sustained, and accessible financing must support Indigenous-led initiatives, institutions, and knowledge systems. No one is better placed to define priorities than Indigenous peoples themselves. We have the solutions. If the international community is serious about achieving the 2030 Agenda, it must invest in Indigenous leadership and co-create mechanisms that are equitable, transparent, and rooted in partnership. Excellencies, friends, we have come far, but the road ahead remains long. UNDRIP is not a document to be celebrated once a year. It is a living framework that must guide how we govern, how we invest, and how we treat one another on the shared Mother Earth. Its full and effective implementation is not optional. It is a moral, legal, and collective obligation. As the United Nations embarks on its next 80 years, it is imperative that Indigenous peoples are not merely seen as beneficiaries of development, but as active partners, solution makers, as demonstrated in various forums, and decision makers in global processes. Only through this can we achieve true justice, sustainability, and respect for all on this planet. Furthermore, it is crucial that Indigenous peoples are not mixed with other sectors of society, as this undermines the years of advocacy and recognition we have earned. Our rights are distinct and must not be conflated with those of other groups, especially those related to the environment, biodiversity, and climate change. This distinction is vital for ensuring our rights, concerns, and contributions are properly recognized and respected. I call on member states to work hand in hand with Indigenous peoples, not only as stakeholders, but as rights holders, knowledge holders, and co-creators of solutions. Member states must ensure that Indigenous peoples are fully respected in decision-making processes, with their governance systems and rights upheld in every aspect of policy and governance. I urge UN entities to embed Indigenous peoples' rights at the core of their work, not as a mere checkbox, but as a fundamental principle of justice, equity, and effectiveness. To achieve this, both member states and the UN entities should actively utilize the recommendations of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as those from the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, ensuring these are reflected in policy and practice. To my fellow Indigenous peoples, I say, we are not alone. Our unity, wisdom, and determination remain our greatest strengths. Let us continue to walk together across generations, across territories, and across the world. I extend my gratitude to my fellow forum members who will engage actively over the next 2 weeks in examining challenges, sharing solutions, and holding the system accountable to our shared goals. I thank the Secretariat for their tireless work and support. Let us move forward together with clarity of purpose, strength of spirit, and an unwavering commitment to a world where the rights of Indigenous peoples are fully respected, protected, and fulfilled. Thank you. Distinguished members of the Forum, distinguished delegates, we will now turn to the election of the other officers of the Bureau for the 24th session of the Forum. In keeping with the Forum's decision at the 23rd session last year, the Forum has designated 7 members for the Bureau this session, of whom we have 5 vice chairs and 1 rapporteur. We shall now proceed to the election of vice chairs. First, I give the floor to distinguished Forum member, Mr. Ali Hajilari.
Thank you so much. In the name of God. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to nominate Ms. Hannah McGlade from Australia, Ms. Nao Min from Myanmar, Mr. Rodrigo Payalev from Chile, Mr. Jeffrey Roth from United States of America, Ms. Indu Omaru Ibrahim from Chad for the positions of Vice Chairs of the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. These selections have been made in recognition of the outstanding qualifications, expertise, and unwavering commitment of these individuals to the rights and well-being of indigenous peoples. Their diverse backgrounds and long-standing engagement with indigenous peoples' issues ensure that the forum work will continue to be guided with insight, dedication, and integrity. It is our collective hope that through their leadership, the forum will continue to elevate the voices of indigenous peoples globally, safeguard their rights, and contribute meaningfully to a future founded on dignity, justice, and mutual respect. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Hajilari for nominating the vice chairs of the 24th session of the Permanent Forum. I now give the floor to distinguished forum member, Mr. Vital Babansi.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished authorities present this morning, distinguished members of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, distinguished delegates, Indigenous brothers and sisters, distinguished guests. A very good morning to Gedeb Dahorum. For me, it's an honour to join my voice with the voice of my colleague Ali to express my absolute support to the appointment of Ms. Animas Gray, Mr. Rodrigo Eduardo Monard, Mr. Jeffrey Roth, and Ms. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim as Vice Chairs of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This was not a random choice, but rather their skills and their wisdom made it an easy choice for us. We wish them every success in their roles. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Babansi for his statement. May I take it that members of the forum wish to elect by acclamation Ms. Hannah McGlade, Ms. Na-Ii Min, Mr. Rodrigo Eduardo Payalev Monard, Mr. Jeffrey Roth, and Ms. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim as Vice Chairs of the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues by acclamation? It is so decided. We now turn to the election of the rapporteur, and I give the floor to distinguished forum member, Ms. Tove Sovdan Gant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Heartfelt congratulations on your election as chair. I have the honor and great pleasure to nominate Suleiman Mamutov of Ukraine for the position as rapporteur for the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Sovdan Gant for nominating the rapporteur of the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I now give the floor to distinguished forum member, Mr. Jeffrey Roth, who was just elected one of the vice chairs for this session.
I also want to congratulate you on the chair, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. I wish to express my full support for the nomination of Suleiman Mamutov, whose experience in the past has created well-suited for the role, has created a well-suited situation for the role. I appreciate all the work that he's done, so thank you.
I thank Mr. Roth for his statement. May I take it that members of the forum wish to elect by acclamation Mr. Suleiman Mamutov as rapporteur of the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues? It is so decided. I would like to congratulate all the distinguished officers of the Bureau of the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues just elected by acclamation. Now, I invite members of the forum to proceed to Agenda Item 2, adoption of the provisional agenda and organization of work for the 24th session. The agenda is contained in document E/C.19/2025/1, approved by the Economic and Social Council in its decision 2024/334 of 23 July 2024 at the recommendation of the forum. May I take it that the provisional agenda is acceptable to all members of the forum? I hear no objection. The agenda for the 24th session is adopted. Distinguished members of the forum, dear colleagues, I now draw the attention of the forum to the proposed organization of work for the session as contained in document E/C.19/2025/L.1/revision 1. This document was prepared by the Substantive Secretariat in consultation with the Chair and members of the forum, and it contains a detailed description of our program of work on a day-to-day basis. Does any member wish to take the floor in this connection? If there are no comments, may I take it that it is the wish of the Permanent Forum members to proceed in accordance with the program of work contained in document L.1/revision 1? I hear no objection. It is so decided. It is now my distinct pleasure to invite the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Gutierrez, to address the Permanent Forum.
Madam Chair, distinguished members of the Forum, dear friends, welcome to this 24th Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and thank you for bringing the voices, insights, aspirations and concerns of Indigenous peoples to this global stage. The world's Indigenous peoples are magnificently diverse in cultures, languages, histories and traditions, but they are united by common features and common challenges. You are the preeminent stewards of the world biodiversity and of the environment. Your knowledge and traditional practices are leading models of conservation and sustainable use, reflecting your commitment to living life in harmony with Mother Earth and to the well-being and rights of future generations. The world has much to learn from your wisdom, insights and approaches which prioritize the health of ecosystems over short-term economic gains. As we tackle the many challenges that we face, building sustainable food systems, moving to sustainable ways of living, and more, we must recognize that the world does not always value you as it should. And so, dear friends, the difficulties facing Indigenous peoples around the world are an affront to dignity and justice, and a source of deep sorrow for me personally. Indigenous women face particular challenges including barriers to political participation, economic opportunities, and essential services. On a trip to Suriname 3 years ago, I had the honor of visiting Kalinga peoples. I witnessed how climate change is devastating their lands and destroying their way of life. And I heard how mercury from illegal mining is harming indigenous peoples in the region, as in many others, namely including Brazil, poisoning their water and food supplies. Tragically, this is a story replicated around the world. Everywhere, indigenous peoples are on the front line of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, despite having done nothing to create this crisis and everything to try to stop them. Eviction and illegal exploitation continue to harm your people and grossly violate your rights. You face marginalization, discrimination, unemployment, economic disadvantage, and horrendous violence, particularly as you seek to defend our common home. And too often, you are excluded from decisions that directly impact your land and territories, threatening your ways of life and food security. Meanwhile, a looming threat grows: the race for minerals critical to the global energy transition, a large proportion of which are located or are close to indigenous peoples' territories. As demand soars, too often we see dispossession, exclusion, and marginalization in decision-making. The rights of indigenous peoples trampled and else jeopardized, all as you are denied the benefits you deserve. So, distinguished members of the Forum and dear friends, we know how to right these wrongs. 18 years ago, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples laid out a blueprint for securing the survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples everywhere. The Declaration has been used by courts, parliaments, and communities to secure rights and galvanize political action. And multilateralism has delivered progress. In the past year, countries have made important new commitments. In the Global Digital Compact, to build digital skills and capacities, including among indigenous peoples. In the Pact for the Futures, calling to recognize, respect, promote, and protect the right of indigenous peoples and their territories, lands, and ecosystems, while safeguarding their traditions, spiritual beliefs, and ancestral knowledge. And to help to do so by ensuring a seat at decision-making tables. And at COP16 on biodiversity, countries committed to create a permanent new subsidiary body, a space for indigenous peoples and others to participate in decision-making on biodiversity. And they agreed on sharing the benefits of digital genetic information with a portion of the new Kali Fund supporting indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples, and particularly the members of this forum, also contributed to the work of the United Nations panel on critical energy transition minerals. The panel's principles and recommendations are grounded in human rights, including the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet, we know that there is much further to go. And I hear your calls for greater and more meaningful participation in the United Nations. The focus of this year's session is implementing the Declaration within Member States and within the United Nations system. And this is an urgent call to action. And I would point to 4 specific areas. First, strengthening the permanent forum. We need Member States to ensure high-level representation. And we need to fortify the Trust Fund on the Indigenous Issues, broadening the donor base and increasing contributions. This is vital to enabling the Forum to deliver its work, including through participation and representation at international meetings. Second, I urge governments and institutions to ensure that the leadership, rights and needs of indigenous peoples are recognized and acted upon across the board. In a world in flux, it is particularly important that governments are alert to the impacts on indigenous peoples, and governments must honor their obligations in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples without delay, and bring indigenous peoples, particularly women, into all forms of decision-making, supporting political participation. Third, international finance providers should make indigenous peoples a key consideration, so that finance flows to their self-determined priorities and projects are included in their action. And fourth, I urge countries, companies and more to work with us to deliver on all the recommendations of the panel on critical energy transition minerals. We'll soon launch the high-level expert advisory group to accelerate action on benefit sharing, value addition and fair trade, and to make sure that the needs and the input of indigenous communities will be key. Let's be clear. The clean energy era must power progress on indigenous people's rights. And so, distinguished members of the Forum, upholding the dignity and worth of every person is central to the work and mission of the United Nations. It is our essence. And because it is at our core, we say loudly and clearly, the individual and collective rights of indigenous peoples are non-negotiable. Now and forever, we stand with you all. Now and forever, we stand with you all in making those rights a reality for indigenous peoples everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the Secretary General for his statement and for his presence here with us this morning. I now have the pleasure to invite the President of the Economic and Social Council, His Excellency Bob Rae of Canada.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me assure you all, I'd like also to greet Chief Sid Hill and, of course, the Secretary General, all members of the Forum, members of states, Indigenous peoples organizations, civil society, elders, ladies and gentlemen. Let me assure you that when I came to work this morning, I was dressed in my traditional garb, a gray suit and a tie. But on the way here, I had a wonderful meeting with members of the Indigenous community of Canada, and I had an opportunity to speak with them. And at the end of the discussion with Chief Wilton Littlechild, who's one of the real founders of the Indigenous movement in our country, but also one of the real fighters and drafters of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, at the end of the discussion, he gave me this shirt, which fits. So I decided that, which in itself is quite something, because it doesn't always happen. From the Masquis Cree, and the Masquis Cree are special peoples in Canada because it is the place where His Holiness the Pope, and we all heard the news of his passing this morning, spoke in the summer of 2022, and Chief Littlechild was there, when the Pope apologized to the Indigenous people of Canada for the abuses that occurred in the residential schools. But beyond that, the Pope went on to deliver remarks and an apology that I think speaks to all of our hearts. We've lost a man today who spoke on behalf of migrants, who spoke on behalf of those who were marginalized, and yes, who recognized the faults and flaws and mistakes of the church, but was willing to engage with all of us in trying to build a better world. And I think it's important for us to echo the words of the Secretary General, who spoke today about the importance of the traditional knowledge, the wisdom, the spirituality, the sustainable practices that have been refined over generations of Indigenous peoples throughout the world. Indigenous peoples have for centuries and for millennia been the governments, have been the nations that have cared for vast ecosystems, forests, wetlands, biodiversity hotspots, and have taken charge and care of land, which subsequently we have allowed to deteriorate and to degenerate. And that's why I think the central message of the forum of advancing the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is so important and so timely and so resonant. It reminds us that the path to meaningful implementation is not linear or easy, but it is a continuous process that requires humility, political will, and more than anything else, it requires the leadership, yes, and the governance of the Indigenous peoples of the world. Chief Littlechild, thank you. Chief Littlechild pointed out in his talk with us this morning, and we, as Canadians, we were very honored to be able to receive his words of wisdom, that the basis for the UN Declaration was a long battle and a long fight. The UN Declaration didn't happen because people turned up in the General Assembly one day and said, let's just do this, it's a good idea. That's not what happened. It required enormous struggle and persuasion to point out that 4 critical elements: treaty implementation, the implementation of treaties that were signed by colonial countries and Indigenous peoples that were supposed to be respected and have not been respected. And therefore, the implementation of treaties is critical throughout the world. Second is the principles of recognition, of respect, and justice. All of us in life want recognition. We want to be seen as who we are, what we have done. But it's now come to the point where we have to move to the third point, where we look at survival, dignity, and well-being. And well-being means, as Chief Littlechild pointed out to me, it also means being well. We need to recognize how troubled and how traumatic the lives of Indigenous people have been allowed to become. But we also need to know that within Indigenous people there is resilience, there is respect, there is determination, and there is dignity, and more than just survival, there is now, in many cases, prosperity, which is as it should be. And the fourth point is a direct, meaningful, and effective participation, which means, yes, free, prior, and informed consent, which is what is required for sovereign peoples. This forum is an important body of the ECOSOC, the council that I have the great honor to preside over this year. It provides a unique platform for advancing Indigenous peoples' rights and development within the UN system, and for collaboration among Indigenous peoples, member states, and the UN system to exchange ideas, to share knowledge, and develop tangible solutions to improve the global well-being of Indigenous people. Je vais parler maintenant en français, so those
I will now speak French.
For a while in my second official language. L'ECOSOC reconnaît
ECOSOC recognizes the vital importance of this work, and we remain completely committed to it in the future. Cooperation between the ECOSOC processes not only benefit the overall situation, it's essential. Indigenous people, their rights, by their very nature, have to do with human rights in general, environmental viability, and social inclusion. A number of subsidiary organs, such as specifically the Commission on the Status of Women, the Forum on Development, and the Forum on Youth that we had a meeting of last week. Along with these, ECOSOC is moving forward with these interconnected priorities.
Of conclusion, that as a Canadian, it is a great honor for me to be able to share with you not only what has gone wrong, of which I spoke earlier, but also what is going right. Many of the things that the Secretary General has referred to are things, frankly, that in Canada we have learned how to deal with, mainly because of the leadership and the fight being led by Indigenous people themselves. We now have Indigenous people with greater responsibility and self-government who have signed agreements that have allowed them to prosper better, to provide better education, that have allowed them to provide for better programs on welfare, and to take full responsibility for the resources under their jurisdiction. The change in our laws and the interpretation of our Constitution has forced our governments to recognize that all the power in Canada is not simply divided between the federal government and the provinces. It must also be shared with Indigenous nations whose sovereignty is now recognized by our courts, and which leads to real change and the possibilities of further and deeper change. We have also gone on with the Commission on Truth and Reconciliation. We have also gone through a process, and we continue to go through a process, where we must recognize the truth of what has gone wrong, where the truth of exploitation, of abuse, where the truth of discrimination and hardship, and yes, the terrible truth of trauma, has to be overcome by a process of dialogue and reconciliation in which the dignity of all is recognized, and in which we come to recognize the dignity of difference as well as the power of unity. I believe that as a world, we must honor and safeguard the rights, the dignity, the quest for recognition of Indigenous peoples, understanding their profound and irreplaceable contributions to our global community. Let me just say, not all wisdom is confined to nation states. The peoples of the world have their wisdom, and the Indigenous peoples of this world have their wisdom as well. Let us together walk this path, together, as partners, with respect, with resolve, and with recognition of the invaluable contributions of Indigenous peoples to the future that we must share. Miigwech, thank you. Merci.
Thank you. I thank the President of the ECOSOC, the President of Economic and Social Council for his statement. And now I will invite His Excellency Viliami Vingatone, Vice President of the General Assembly, to make a statement on behalf of the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Philemon Yang.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to address the 24th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I warmly welcome the Indigenous peoples present here today. I congratulate the Chair on her election and wish all of you a productive and meaningful session. This forum remains a vital platform not only to celebrate the rich cultural and linguistic diversity of Indigenous peoples, but to hear from them directly, to learn from their wisdom, and to better understand the challenges they face and the aspirations they hold. That understanding enables us to craft more effective policies to support their needs. Excellencies, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted by the General Assembly in 2007, offers a universal framework for advancing the rights, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples everywhere. This vision aligns closely with one of the central priorities of my presidency, the protection of human rights and dignity for everyone, everywhere, and to uphold their right to be meaningfully involved in matters that affect them as determined by law and in accordance with international human rights obligations. Indeed, there has been progress. Several member states have taken concrete measures and made progress to uphold and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples and to involve them in decision-making in matters that affect them. Provisions of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples have been integrated at national, regional, and global levels. Nationally, Indigenous peoples' rights have been recognized in constitutions and laws in several countries. Such efforts are in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the principle of leaving no one behind. Yet much more remains to be done. Nearly 2 decades after the adoption of the Declaration, its implementation remains incomplete. Concrete action is still lacking. Many member states, United Nations entities, and stakeholders must go further. By developing national action plans, amending laws, and building institutions in true partnership with Indigenous peoples. Meanwhile, Indigenous communities continue to face the harshest impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, poverty, and limited access to education and health care. These persistent disparities demand urgent, sustained attention. This session offers us a chance to confront the challenges and deliver on the Declaration. We need real, tangible action. Action that advances equality, protects cultural heritage, and empowers all Indigenous peoples, women and men, to shape their own futures. Excellencies, Indigenous peoples must have the right to set their own priorities while preserving their cultures, traditions, and identities. They deserve not only to be heard, but to live lives of dignity, peace, and well-being, grounded in justice and equality. This session must be more than a forum for dialogue. It must be a moment of resolve. Let us seize this moment to translate the promise of the Declaration into meaningful change to uphold the rights and dignity of Indigenous peoples and leave no one behind. I thank you.
Thank you. I thank the Vice President of the General Assembly for his statement. Now I will invite the Minister for Environment of Colombia, Her Excellency Lena Yanina Estrada Añocasi.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Excellencies, leaders, and Indigenous authorities.
Nosotros los pueblos.
We the peoples. We the peoples are the introductory words of the United Nations Charter of 1945. And there is no space, no forum at the UN that gives more meaning to this phrase than the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I thank the creator, the custodian of life, Kai Mo Buinaima, and the spirits of our ancestors who are here with us, who guide us and who weave our path. I also extend my regards to the Onondaga Nation, who are the original administrators of this land that today we call Manhattan. I'm Shusikuri, but my Western name is Lena Estrada, of the Witoto Munaca people, born in the heart of the Colombian Amazon. A daughter of tobacco, coca leaf, and sweet yucca. Like the word woman, it's a word that gives sweetness, convinces, and heals. It's an honour for me to participate in this session of the Permanent Forum, and a place that really upholds this sentiment. Today, as the first Indigenous woman to be Minister for the Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia, I'm aware of how heavy my words weigh, and aware of the importance of joining our voices together and bringing us together, we, the Indigenous peoples of the world, so that we can tackle the crisis that we face. More than a century ago, the word original, as in Indigenous peoples, was brought to the multilateral scene and was said for the first time in Geneva with Descahe. Since then, this word has run through the centres of power, giving life to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. However, this word only lives if we allow it to do so, we the Indigenous peoples. Madam Chair, today, almost 2 decades since it was adopted, this session of the Forum brings us together to discuss the challenges and the progress made in the implementation of the Declaration. On behalf of the government of President Gustavo Petro, please allow me to refer to the main global challenges that we face in the implementation of the Declaration and to the violations of our rights that still persist across the world. Our mobilization, the mobilization of we the peoples, is therefore more urgent than ever. First of all, at the heart of these inequalities and violence, we have women, grandmothers, Indigenous girls who face a dangerous nexus of multiple and intersectional discrimination due to their gender, as well as their Indigenous identity. And we face disproportionate levels of violence, marginalisation, and systemic abandonment. Secondly, extractivism continues to creep into our lands. Mining, fossil fuel extraction, deforestation, mega projects and industry that are highly polluting, like the petrochemical industry, all of these things are a real threat to our existence. These global problems exacerbate the situations of vulnerability and flout our collective right to self-determination, which is safeguarded through tools like free, prior, and informed dissent. My father taught in his poetry about the pain caused by the devastation of Amazonian territories, and this was motivated by greed, grabbing our resources, and today this is something that continues under the same logic of exploitation, wrecking, polluting. Today, I am celebrating the 37-year anniversary of the establishment of the largest indigenous reserve in the world with more than 6 million hectares. That's the place I'm from, the Chorrera, in the Colombian Amazon. Thirdly, the meaningful participation laid down in the Declaration is limited at the UN for the representatives of indigenous peoples due to the many structural barriers that we face, such as the fact that indigenous peoples organisations are considered civil society organisations. Fourthly, measures to make cultural practices criminalised and illegal, as well as the religious and spiritual practices that are related to the cultivation and use of plants by indigenous peoples, and that at the same time are subject to the international fight against the drug trade. These things are a stumbling block to the implementation of the Declaration. Lastly, despite headway made in strengthening the institutional architecture of the UN system to promote and protect the rights of indigenous peoples, it remains necessary to increase coordination of efforts engaged in by the different bodies of the United Nations, with mechanisms such as the Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, and the UN Voluntary Trust Fund for indigenous peoples. Madam Chair, if I may, please allow me to present some concrete proposals which can be considered as a global call to action for us to tackle these challenges. First of all, we must be recognised as indigenous peoples subject to rights, as right holders, not as objects or as stakeholders. Therefore, I launch an appeal to firmly support the creation of a new status, a status that is different to that held by civil society organisations, that would be able to guarantee the full, effective and meaningful participation of indigenous peoples within the United Nations. Secondly, it's urgent to ramp up the implementation of General Comment 39 of the CEDAW Committee on the rights of indigenous women and girls. We must reaffirm our commitment to our collective and individual rights. Autonomy over our bodies and our lands, cultural and linguistic sovereignty, food sovereignty, and our access to justice without discrimination and with dignity. Thirdly, it's necessary to guarantee the rights of indigenous peoples, including the respect of our health and medicine practices, our traditional knowledge also in the implementation of drug control measures. And it's also necessary to look at the effectiveness of the international drug control system and to harmonise it with international human rights law. Fourthly, I launch an appeal to follow up on the implementation of the outcome document of the International Conference on Indigenous Peoples that was agreed on and adopted in 2014, and in order to appoint a high-level UN official tasked with raising awareness as to the rights of Indigenous peoples and to boost the coherence of activities carried out within the United Nations to this end. In fifth place, as the highest level authority over the environment in Colombia, I will be heading up all efforts that I possibly can to ensure that countries can promote and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, and that the countries doing this can support us in making headway with the multilateral environment agenda in order to achieve real human rights-based solutions to the triple planetary crisis: loss of biodiversity, climate change, and pollution. I wish to launch an appeal to increase the direct allocation of finance to Indigenous peoples for the climate and biodiversity, and this through multilateral funds, in line with the mandates and decisions of government bodies, recognising the important role and contributions that they can make to address and to respond to climate change, and as the custodians of biodiversity and partners in the conservation, restoration and sustainable use of biodiversity. The Cali Fund for Biodiversity that was adopted at the COP16 on biodiversity in Cali, Colombia, is a great example in recognising Indigenous peoples as rights holders, that is, for the right to access resources for the protection of nature. When it comes to climate change, COP30 should be an Indigenous COP. In Colombia, we will continue to blaze this trail, and we will do this tirelessly. We are committed to providing direct access to climate financing for Indigenous people at this COP. Furthermore, the world must commit to a new treaty on the non-proliferation of fossil fuels. This would ensure that we would be able to move away from the fossil fuel economy in an orderly and just way. The COP30 should also consider the inclusion of indigenous financing mechanisms such as debt relief. And to achieve this, an urgent reform of the international financial system is required. This is urgent, so that countries like Colombia are not punished by risk assessment systems, and so that the peoples are able to access these resources directly. When it comes to the scourge of pollution, we trust in the fact that the negotiations for the treaty to put an end to plastics pollution will be successfully delivered, and that the future legally binding instrument will benefit from the tools that it requires to ensure the rights and the participation of Indigenous peoples, including when it comes to the means for implementation. However, above all, we hope that the expansion of the petrochemical and plastics industries will be halted, that production is reduced, and that chemicals of concern are controlled. Furthermore, looking to the seventh session of the UN Environment Assembly, we must ensure that our people are at the heart of the discussions, that we are fully participating. Furthermore, Colombia launches an appeal to member states to support a mandate to advance with a global instrument that addresses the crisis caused by the extraction of critical minerals. Mining should not come at a cost to the rights of nature or the rights of Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous peoples of the Amazon, the land that gave birth to me are at the very heart of the beating heart, really, of the solutions for this triple crisis. Therefore, we must ensure that the Amazon is placed at the very heart of the decisions that we make at the UN. Furthermore, in Cali, the subsidiary body of the Convention on Biological Diversity was approved in order to implement Article 8J on the preservation of the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, placing indigenous knowledge systems at the very crux of this. Madam Chair, since the last session of the Forum, the United Nations has adopted the Pact for the Future and its annexes, and these refer to the need to continue to work together in order to protect the indigenous peoples of the world. I'd like to conclude my speech by launching an appeal for the urgent implementation of Action 32 of the Pact for the Future on the protection of the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples, and Commitment 16 of the Declaration on Future Generations on the recognition, respect and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples and their territories, lands and ecosystems. I conclude with the words of an indigenous poet from my land, Anastasia Kandre, who said, "This is my word. It will never run out, it will never die, it will continue to blow like the wind." And that's what I hope we can all do here, all of us here and all of our peoples. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Agradezco la...
Thank you very much. I thank the Minister of the Environment of Colombia. Thank you for your words and thank you for being here.
I have the pleasure to invite Mr. Lee Jinhua, the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, to make a statement.
Secretary General, Madam Chairperson, members of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, honorable elders, excellencies, delegates, and friends. Welcome to the 24th session of United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This annual gathering is crucial for dialogue, cooperation, and commitment towards advancing the rights and the well-being of the indigenous peoples worldwide. I extend my deepest gratitude to the members of the Permanent Forum, indigenous peoples' representatives, and all participants for their dedication and commitment. I also welcome the participation of the member states and entities of the United Nations system, which is essential to the success of the foreign sessions. The UN system continues to strengthen the inclusion of the indigenous peoples' voices in our work. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the expert mechanism on the rights of the indigenous peoples, and the special rapporteur on the rights of the indigenous peoples have paved the way for the full and effective participation of the indigenous peoples. Under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, indigenous peoples continue to climate negotiations, bring in their knowledge to the table. Similarly, under the Convention on the Biological Diversity, the indigenous peoples are involved in discussions on biodiversity conservation. However, the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples is still lacking. I urge member states to seriously pursue their meaningful engagement in decision-making. The Pact for the Future emphasizes the importance of integrating the knowledge of the indigenous peoples and ensuring their meaningful participation in global governance. It commits to protecting and complementing their knowledge and fostering the synergies between their practices, science, and technology. In this regard, a growing influence of Indigenous peoples' voices in the lead-up to the 2026 Water Conference is an integral part of the process. Likewise, I encourage Indigenous peoples to actively engage in the preparations for the Second World Summit for Social Development to be held in Qatar this November. The summit will review the progress and the gaps in implementing the Copenhagen Declaration and the Program of Action, addressing the social dimension of the sustainable development. It will focus on poverty eradication, decent work, social inclusion, and the inequalities. Your participation is crucial to advancing the people-centered approach to 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which aims to leave no one behind. Member states have been encouraged to include Indigenous peoples as members of their official delegations. Indigenous-led NGOs should also participate actively in the lead-up and during the summit. Indigenous peoples can offer unique perspectives and solutions, drawing from their rich cultural heritage and the traditional knowledge. Excellencies, the special theme of this year's forum is implementing the United Nations Declaration on Rights of the Indigenous Peoples within the United Nations member states and the United Nations system, including identifying the good practices and addressing challenges. I invited all the UN entities to integrate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into their field programming. This integration should be guided by the recommendations of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, establishing the participatory mechanisms that ensure the active participation of Indigenous peoples in the planning, implementation, and the evaluation of this program is paramount. This not only respects the Indigenous people's rights, but it also enhances the effectiveness and sustainability of such programs. Addressing challenges means overcoming barriers such as systemic discrimination, lack of political will, and insufficient resources. It involves the fostering the partnerships between governments, Indigenous peoples, and the other stakeholders to create inclusive and sustainable solutions that honor the spirit of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As the UN senior official responsible for coordinating follow-up to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, I'm pleased to report continued progress in implementing the UN System-wide Action Plan on Indigenous Peoples. The Interagency Support Group on Indigenous Issues, comprising over 42 UN entities, continues its collaborative efforts to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples within the UN system. The Interagency Support Group has drafted a framework for the UN country team to track the progress on inclusion, participation, and integration of Indigenous people's rights. This work will reflect the significant progress in promoting Indigenous people's rights at the country level. The Interagency Group has also established working groups on direct financing for climate action to Indigenous peoples and strengthening the UN support for Indigenous human rights defenders. Distinguished delegates, I would like to take this opportunity to extend my sincere thanks to the member states that have generously contributed to Trust Fund on Indigenous issues in the past year. Canada, Denmark, and Estonia. I urged all the member states and other donors to consider contributing to the Trust Fund. Your support is essential to our ongoing efforts to advance the rights, well-being, and development of indigenous peoples worldwide. I wish you all a successful and productive session of the forum. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs for his statement. Distinguished members of the forum, distinguished observers, ladies and gentlemen, we have now concluded the opening meeting of this session. The forum will reconvene at 3 o'clock today in the conference room 4 to begin its consideration of agenda item 5E, interregional, intergenerational, and global dialogue, rights of Indigenous women. In accordance with our program of work, this will be an interactive, high-level dialogue. This meeting is adjourned.